Payments Podcast from Bottomline Technologies.
Greetings and thanks for joining us today on the Payments Podcast. In this episode, which we're calling Tracking the Evolution of AP Automation, we're going to explore how one of the most dynamic categories in the payables universe is expanding and finding new levels of influence within the organizations that have integrated them. More importantly, we hope it can serve as a call to action for the companies that are still struggling with manual AP processes. Now, before I introduce our guest for today's episode, I'd like to read a quote. Transforming accounts payable operations can deliver a compelling ROI if the right resources are aligned behind the optimal technology. There are many different types of solutions and providers in the e-payables automation market, and selecting the right one for your business requires planning, collaboration, vision, as well as a general understanding of your business and its needs and requirements both today and into the future. The author is our guest today, Bob Cohen. He's Vice President of Research at Ardent Partners and one of the best analysts in the business. Bob heads up Ardent's practice focused on fintech solutions and services that improve financial-related processes and performance, including procure-to-pay, accounts payable, B2B payments, working capital management, supply chain finance, and business networks. Ardent has a new report out called the 2023 E-Payables Technology Advisor. We're happy to have Bob on the podcast today. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. Let's get right to it here. We'll unpack some of the report as we go today. Let's talk first about AP automation at this moment in time. I think, Bob, the top line benefits of AP automation are familiar to our listeners. I mean, in short, we take spreadsheets and other manual processes, we digitize them, we're greater efficiency, greater accuracy. Always a good idea, but reading from your work, I learned there are other benefits. What would you say are some of the business dynamics that have made AP automation more urgent right now?
Sure, great question, John. The events of the past couple of years have certainly put a spotlight on accounts payable and shown the importance of the function. Previously, probably a poor misconception was that AP was a back office function that didn't impact the rest of the enterprise. Well, we've showed during the pandemic that that was anything but the truth. So what we see going forward is that AP became a vital core process during the pandemic. They showed that they do more than just pay bills. They're responsible for ensuring the sustainability of the business, making sure things get paid at the right time to the right people. How does it impact the suppliers and the supply chain network? How do we impact the cash flow, working capital management of an organization? So AP became, front and center during the pandemic, because if bills don't get paid, guess what happens? Nothing. Suppliers get angry, shipments don't occur. And so AP became front and center here. And the spotlight was on AP, and there's a lot more focus on requesting information from AP in order to understand what was going on in the business and take steps forward.
Now, you get to talk to people who actually do this for a living. And we want to tap into that. As you just said, pandemic put a lot of pressure on a lot of companies at a lot of levels. What about AP automation do you think has changed in this post-pandemic environment?
Sure. And, in my role here, I have the luxury to talk to both practitioners, those that are actually in accounts payable managers, supervisors, VP of finance, CFOs, AP clerks, as well as solution providers, similar to Bottomline, those that are offering solutions to help address the issues that are here. So, what's changed in the past couple of years? It's the urgency and it's the tools that are available to help enterprises automate their accounts payable processes. So, that's really what's changed. And, we see more and more solution providers offering more and more advanced technology and applying it to the accounts payable problems. So, what we've learned is that, or what we've seen is the implementation of things such as AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, RPA being applied on a wholesale level by many solution providers to help improve the efficiency, productivity, and overall capabilities of AP automation solutions.
Interesting. So you mentioned data, and I've always been fascinated by this part of AP automation because it has to throw off a lot of data. We call data the new oil. But I sense from your report, Bob, that companies aren't doing as much as they can with the data generated by AP automation.
Yeah, you're 100% accurate there. If you think about accounts payable, it sits on a wealth of data, payment information, supplier information, terms, just an inordinate amount of data that's largely gone untapped for centuries, if you will. Why? Because it's all been locked up in file cabinets on spreadsheets, and it's really tough to get an accurate view of this. So, what we've seen is that there's a realization that the data that AP sits on top of is extremely valuable. So more tools are being applied to how do we access this data? How do we take the data and use it for forecasting, budgeting, and planning? How do we take data and use it for cash flow analysis? We all know that cash is, credit is getting more expensive. Cash is getting more expensive today. And so there's a focus on managing cash that maybe there, wasn't as important, when cash was cheap in terms of lower interest rates here. So, effective cash flow management is critical for businesses of all sizes. And leveraging the real-time financial data that organizations can gain by accessing the information that AP has been sitting on is invaluable. There's also, from a fraud and compliance perspective, understanding how suppliers are being paid, when they're being paid, what changes are occurring to payment files, when those changes are occurring here, can all play a huge role in helping to prevent and mitigate fraudulent exposure by organizations there. And also, what we're seeing is that AP organizations, as I mentioned, were brought into the spotlight. And so other parts of the business, whether it's procurement or treasury or finance, have now started to come to AP and ask for data they can use to turn into information that they can turn into value for the organization there. So, we've seen a market change in organizations that realize they've been sitting on a wealth of data that's gone largely untapped. And now there are tools that can help organizations unlock this data. And it really turns AP into a center of knowledge and a value adding part of the organization.
Yeah, it's clear from our conversation so far and from reading the report that we're just scratching the surface of everything AP automation can do. But here I want to back up just a bit, Bob. What are some of the issues that are more top of mind with you in light of this report?
We just mentioned a few of those. Fraud is on the upswing. We've seen that. So, understanding how to tackle fraud, to prevent fraud, to take steps, put processes in place, put automation in place in order to help prevent this. Also, what we've seen in the past probably 5 or 6 years is that the interest in the end of what we call the e-payables framework, the payment side of the business, has gotten increased attention here. So many organizations automated how they received invoices and how they processed invoices, but the payments was largely done in a manual process. So what we're seeing is that in the past 5 or 6 years, there's been an increased focus on how and when we pay suppliers. Paper checks are still pretty prevalent in our society, with upwards of 40% of invoices being paid in a paper fashion, according to our most recent e-payables research. But what we see is that the amount of paper invoices is on the way down, and there's a market increase in electronic payments that are going on. So whether that's ACH, whether that's ACH plus, wire payments, purchasing cards, virtual cards, we're seeing a huge upswing in that because organizations realize they need to manage cash better. There's an opportunity to turn AP from a cost center into a profit center using various payment methods that are going on. There's much more accuracy and information that can be garnered when you automate your accounts payable payment process there. So as far as timing, as far as reconciliation. So I think that's one of the major things that we're seeing here is there's a huge shift towards paying electronically. And, organizations realized during the pandemic that paying by check, which they always knew to be inefficient and costly and susceptible to fraud became even more apparent during the pandemic when organizations needed to send AP clerks or AP workers to the office. They became essential workers. They needed to open up the mail to take invoices. They needed to physically have check runs and have somebody sign these checks. All problems they knew or inefficiencies that were well known, but became much more apparent during the pandemic. So what we've seen is that organizations are taking more of a proactive approach to this is not the way forward. This leaves us exposed, and we need to figure out ways to automate the process. We need to automate the entire e-payables framework, but we've seen a market increase on the payment side.
So proactive approach, I like that a lot. In preparing for this, I know that it's very settled when we talk about what AP automation can do. It seems to be very static discipline, if you will. But the more I talk to you and the more that I got into the report, when you integrate AP automation, it's just the beginning. It's a category that's truly evolving. Can you talk about that evolution a bit?
Yeah, without a doubt. When we talk to clients, when we counsel solution providers, we talk about AP as a journey. It's not a destination. Some organizations out there think that, okay, we've automated the capture of all of our invoices. We're done. That's not true. You're just embarking on a transformation that's going to be a journey that, doesn't end, right? You keep tackling different pieces of the puzzle there. You obviously, when you take a look at, digital transformation of AP, when you take a look at this journey and not a destination, you want to begin, with the end in mind. What does success look like for your organization? And it's more than just automating the manual, labor-intensive, paper-intensive processes. That's just the beginning of the process, the beginning of the journey. And once you've done that, it really starts to unlock the capabilities of AP from a back office tactical function to one that's more strategic, one that's more value adding, one where we can take a look at, things such as how can we get involved in spend management? How can we get involved in supplier relationships? How can we improve those vendor relationships? How can we improve the cash and the distribution of the organization forecast through AP? So there's a huge opportunity here for AP. And, if you think of AP as, or, if you're going from a manual to an automated process, if you think, hey, we've just automated everything and now we're done, that's a far cry from the truth. That's really where the opportunity starts to begin. And you can start to really open up and leverage all of the data that AP has been sitting on for gain throughout the organization. It's, when you take a look at, who does AP interact with? Suppliers. So they play a key role in supplier relationships there. AP is typically the second largest cash disbursement organization or department within an organization there, followed by payroll. So who does that, what does that mean? That means that they can interact with Treasury. So they understand when invoices come in, when they route it around and prove successfully and they're ready to pay. Now Treasury can get involved because Treasury manages the cash for the organization. So now you can work at a much more strategic level with a Treasury function there. When you come to procurement, we're talking about suppliers and, you may have contracts that have been negotiated, but that's what's been negotiated. What's the reality of the situation? AP now sits on this data saying, did we get the discounts that we were entitled to? Maybe are we entitled to more discounts? All these different things. So, we're on the precipice here. Yes, AP automation has been around for 20, 25 years. We understand that, but really we're just starting to see more organizations change the view of AP from a back office function to more strategic, to more value adding. And, data is power, and data, knowledge is what's going to help AP move forward and continuing to move forward and add more value to the organization.
Excellent. Well said. I'd like to get to one of the sections of the report, the Ardent e-Payables report. I found it fascinating that vision was one of the criteria you use for evaluating providers. In this context, what does good vision look like from your perspective?
Sure. Good vision means anticipating what the future is going to look like, what AP is going to need in the future. And that's the vision that we're talking about here. When you think about AP automation, as I said, we'll take the paper, we'll eliminate the paper invoices that are coming in rather than routing things around manually. We understand that, those are kind of table stakes, if you will, but it's understanding how are we going to incorporate new technologies, artificial intelligence, AI is in the news these days, it's everywhere, machine learning, RPA, robotic process automation are all, things that are front and center for organizations. How, when we talk about vision, we want to understand how solution providers are planning to leverage this technology going forward. Are they using AI to improve the match rates, the approval rates, to automate the filling in of coding, and are they doing it on a predictive level? Are they organizations or solution providers, exploring predictive analytics, within the AP organization? Are they taking their solution and making it less back officey and more like a consumer product there, an end user product there, which is, very intuitive to use. And, there's, you don't want to say game like, but, it's intuitive and, very easy to use and very integrated there. So we talk about vision. It's not what's available today. It's how are they leveraging the technologies? What are their plans for those? How are they expanding outside the normal scopes? How are they incorporating data analytics, planning for big data within AP to leverage all this information? So when we look at vision, we want to understand, what's going on in the future, where do they see their solution going? Where do they see the AP profession going? And what steps are they taking to achieve those? What are they doing from a fraud and compliance perspective? How are they improving their offerings to, as I mentioned, to help mitigate this? How are they leveraging AI, ML, and RPA in all facets of automation of the AP function?
Well, you've certainly laid that out for us. Thank you. So that's a wrap for this episode of the Payments Podcast. My guest has been Ardent's Bob Cohen. Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here. Have a great day.
And please find us where you find your leading podcasts. That would be Apple, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Until then, see you next time.
From Bottom Line Technologies.